Well, thank you very much for coming to this event, the Right to Private Contract. And this came about because of numerous conversations we've had with our members over time where the right to private contract is not really understood. Even though really that's the way real estate agents, brokers, lenders, other private business people make their living, is entering into a contract with another person or party. That's essentially what we do. So we thought this would be a good example, a good time to go ahead and try and review the contract, but review it in terms of some of the impacts that court cases or government policy has had, so that you have part of that as part of your thinking as well when you're writing those contracts, the impacts that some of that has had on us and will continue to have on us. So think about a world, just imagine a world in which there was no property rights. You didn't have a right to have your own home, your own condo, or any other dwelling. You didn't have the right to even a property to yourself, meaning that your work, your intelligence, you didn't have a right to that. You didn't have a right to negotiate how you were going to work, for whom you were going to work, how much you were going to work for, because the king owned everything. They owned the land, and the people on the land, all of them were tenants. And then because of that, the king could also tell you what you were going to do with your life. He could decide if you were going to be in the marketplace, as in the central market, or if you were going to make shoes, or whatever it is that he decided he needed you to do. So all that started changing in 1215. For those of us who are part of Western philosophy and Western history, that's when the Magna Carta was signed. And with the Magna Carta, we actually have the first property deed, if you really look at it and think about it, because the king actually deeded his property, tracts of his property, to individuals. Granted, those individuals were the nobility, but the concept of a king granting his land to someone else, and with that land grant came certain promises. You could occupy and use the land. You could transfer the land through sale or inheritance. You could go ahead and be assured that you would have quiet enjoyment. You would be the only person able to use that land unless you gave permission to someone else. And along with those rights came a promise from the king that no future king would take back that land. So fast forward through history to America, and our founding fathers embraced that idea of the property right and also expanded it to say, yes, you have a property within yourself. You have the ownership of your intelligence and your gifts and talents and your time and your labor. And you start combining those things together. And for America, it set the foundation for us to not just have the right to own private property, but actually an encouragement that individuals should own private property, and particularly real property. That becomes a foundation to our founding and to our society. How do we transfer private property rights from one person or entity to another? We use contracts. That is how we do it. We make sure that the property rights that are being transferred, either in whole or in part, are being transferred correctly so that the owner of the property or the seller of the property and the tenant or the buyer are each receiving what it is they thought they would be able to receive, and they know exactly what they can do with the rights they've received. So in a lease contract, the property owner is only giving some of their property rights to the tenant, occupancy and use. Probably not encumbrance. Probably not going to give that tenant the right to encumbrance. So certain rights are given, and we do that through the use of the contract. That is what we're going to be talking about, is how do we make sure that when we write our contracts, the rights that are being transferred are the rights that the property owner and either the buyer or the tenant have agreed upon and they understand. So that's what today's discussion is about. We're going to start out for our first hour and a half with Nikki Salgat. Nikki is the general counsel for Arizona REALTORS. She also is the person that if you're part of the forms committees over there in discussions, you will be talking to Nikki. She will be the staff liaison for that group. And obviously, if you're a broker or agent, you've probably talked to her on more than one occasion about, but Nikki, what if? What happened? What do you suggest? And she is the person that you generally will be talking to when you walk in a room and say, what do I do now? And she's the person that you can refer to. She's a wealth of information, has a lot of experience, both in the private sector as well as in the association sector, and she's had experiences through multiple types of real estate events. So she's a great asset that we have. I'd like to bring up Nikki Salgat, and we're going to talk to her for an hour.
Thank you. I think you just set the standard really high. Thank you for having me today. I hope everyone can hear us there too, and there's no feedback, so that's great.
Yeah, we're doing good. So let's start out with something. First of all, tell us a bit about yourself, how you came to practice real estate law in particular, and how you ended up here at Arizona Association of REALTORS.
Sure. So I have actually, believe it or not, I started out as a paralegal. I worked for, is that me?
No, you're fine.
Okay. I worked for Rick Mack, and so I started out as a paralegal for them. And while I was a paralegal, I thought, well, I really want to know what the lawyers are talking about. I want to understand their strategy.
You're fine. Yeah,
Okay.
it just...
And so ultimately, I decided to go to law school while I worked for Rick. And so after working for Rick, then of course when Scott moved over to the association, I led the short sale division at that point in time because he moved over to the association. And then every time I would present with Scott, I would say, when are you going to hire? Are you hiring anybody? Are you hiring an attorney yet? So at some point, he actually asked me to submit my resume, and then I interviewed with Michelle, and they decided to take me on as an attorney at the association.
Nice. So describe your job as general counsel. What does that even mean?
So for most of you that may or may not know, I've been in this role now for almost 3 months. And so I keep saying to people, don't get me fired yet, okay? Let me still learn the job. I'm drinking from a fire hose right now because although Scott and I have worked hand in hand and we've been at the association for, he's been there about 10 years, so I'm just a year behind him, we didn't perform the same tasks. So some of those tasks that I do, of course, were the attorney for the association. But part of that, in that role, we review contracts, or I shouldn't say we, because Scott is now the CEO. I review contracts before Scott now signs them. I am the staff liaison for the Risk Management Committee. And under the Risk Management Committee, we have two standing committees, which is the Grievance Committee and the Professional Standards Committee. So part of the risk management portion, we watch the legal hotline. I handled the website with all of the risk management material, professional standards material that is on the website. So if you ever see anything or have a question, please contact me because somehow, some reason, they gave me access to the backside of our website, and I can change that. If it's outdated, whatever the case is. And so as the staff liaison, I help lead the work groups for whenever forms are being changed.
So if you've never participated in one of these forums committees, I'm going to tell you, it's a ton of fun, and you meet a lot of interesting people. So I want you to tell us about the AR forums committees, their purpose, how you interact with them, and then how our members can avail themselves of the opportunity potentially to be part of a forums committee.
Sure.
And at the end of that, talk to us about the sending out through the loop, what that is and why you do it.
Right. So I'm going to give a 500-level viewpoint of how it starts. Ultimately, if there is something as practitioners that you see with a form that you think could change or could make it better, we have a form for you to ask for a form request. So you would just contact us and say, here's what I think we could change about the form. This is what is going to make it better as practitioners, because us as lawyers, we don't practice, right? So practice is sometimes different than what we're going to know, and we don't see the everyday, daily in and out. And if you have a great suggestion, what we do is we send you that form, you fill it out saying, here's the form that I would like looked at. So for instance, right now I have about 3 requests on my desk for the additional clause addendum to be revised And that form, they've given specifics on what they think should change. So the appraisal waiver, for instance, is one of them. And it says appraisal waiver, but it's really the appraisal contingency waiver, right? So that's why they're saying, let's change that so that it actually mirrors more what they are waiving. And so that's going to go to Risk Management Committee at our next meeting to say, hey, should we open this form up so that we can revise it to make it a better practitioner's tool when they use it out in the field? And so that's the beginning process. And then what happens is the Risk Management Committee determines whether or not, based on the request, it's something that needs immediate attention or it's something that can go in a file. And what we do is we take all of the suggestions and put them in a file for whatever form, and when it's time for the form to be revised, we pull that file and make sure that we look at all of the suggestions when a work group is formed. So if you're ever interested in participating on a work group, please contact us, because you would not believe, if you've never served on one, and I know that as practitioners, you might come out when a new form is released or a revised form is released, you're sitting there thinking to yourself, why did they do this? Well, that's what part of being on the work group does for you. You get to realize that they just spent half an hour on whether it should be and or and or, right? So that is part of the conversation that is really great to hear everything that they talk about and all of the scenarios that are discussed, just to come up with what is the best revision for those practitioners. And so that is so if you ever want to get on a work group, because we are always looking for people to volunteer and participate, we heavily rely on practitioners because you guys are in the weeds. You know the scenarios. You've been through it. Again, I don't practice real estate. I don't, I've not ever sold a property. I've purchased my own, sold my own, but it's pretty limited. So we need that feedback. And then after the work group creates what they believe to be a final form, then they send it out to the loop. So if you're not part of the loop, I don't know, do you guys know what the loop is? Okay, so what the loop is, a group of folks, we have about 4,500 people that have signed up to be on the loop. And they are the first people that get to see any revised form that is about to go out before any revisions are accepted. So if you want to be part of the loop and see that form and have a say and comment on it, please contact Jan Steward. So it's Jan Steward, STEWARD at aaronline.com, and she will ensure that you are added onto that loop. So when you're added on the loop, so for instance, we are sending out the SPUDS revision. So we just created a SPUDS work group. The SPUDS are going out tomorrow. So the seller's property disclosure statement, that we have it, no, I'm sorry, today is Friday. It's going out today. It's slated to go out today to the loop for all the practitioners that are signed up on the loop and hopefully they forward it to anybody they know, because we appreciate that. We need all the eyes on it that we could possibly see. And then if they have any concern or comments about any of the changes, they submit them back to Jan Steward, and Jan is fantastic. She organizes all of the comments so that when we review the form again, the work group will then meet and review every single comment that was submitted to us. And then we will have full discussions about whether or not it's something that we should consider to revise, something that maybe the work group didn't think about. And so that's after the work group then reviews all of the comments, makes any changes based on those comments, they submit the form to the Risk Management Committee. The Risk Management Committee then determines whether or not they believe that this is a good product or if they should send it back to the work group to work on some more. If the Risk Management Committee accepts the document as is, then it goes to the Executive Committee, who then determines, who then either approves the form or sends it back. Generally speaking, by then it's approved, and then you'll see it released on one of the 3 dates that we release forms, which is a huge risk management tool, right? So as long as you know that February 1st, June 1st, and October 1st are the only dates that we are going to release revised forms, then always be aware. Now, they're always going to be uploaded, into the forms providers, but just that's when you want to be on the, aware. We, of course, publish educational material in advance so that our membership is hopefully aware. We've made these changes, and here's how, we tend to send out FAQs to say, here's how you're going to address these changes in practicing. But that is the only time, and there's always an exception, right? There's an exception to every rule. And the exception to this rule is in the event there's a change in law, because we want to make sure that you guys are always practicing legally. And so if there's a change in law, then of course we're going to open a forum up and we're going to revise it, because we want to make sure that you guys, we're reducing your risk at all points in time. And that's the gist of how the process works.
So you had mentioned early on in your comments that you put the comments that people have made about a possible change form that in the forms that they want to see into basically a tickler file, and when it's time to revise that form. So what tells you, is there a calendared time to revise particular forms, or is it when a certain number of comments have come in and you realize that form really needs to be addressed? How do you decide when it's time?
So the risk management chair, when we receive a request, the risk management chair says, okay, this is something that's important enough, we need to discuss it at the risk management meeting. And then the risk management committee then determines whether or not to open up the form and create a work group. In this instance, the SPUDS has not had a full-on revision. I mean, we've revised bits and pieces of it for change in law, whatever the case is. But we haven't had a full-on revision since like 2014. So we had a pretty thick file. So you'll be anxious to see, I mean, some minor things like, do you have a cluster mailbox? Where is it located and what is the box number, right? We added that to the SPUDS because you would not believe how many comments we had that said, where's the location and tell us the box number. So some things are minor and some things, the changes are going to be bigger. And so we really need that feedback.
Great. So I will encourage you to volunteer to be part of one of these forms committees. And when they email Jan and say, I want to be a part of this, do they need to say, I am interested in disclosure type of things or solar type of things, or is it just I'm interested in knowing about when the next committee is going to be?
I would say whatever it is that you want to do, if you are very specific to you would prefer a specific form, let us know. But if you also want to just participate on any form, because we do keep a file and we try to ensure that all of our members are utilized. And just be aware that if you aren't chosen, don't feel bad about it, because we try to get a fair representation of the whole state. So in other words, these forms are used statewide. We want to make sure that the folks in Yuma and the folks in the north, up in Havasu or Prescott, that everybody, because the metropolitan Phoenix area, we can always get lots of volunteers there too. But we have to always have a fair representation statewide to make sure that we are addressing everybody's concerns.
And that's where it gets really interesting in those meetings, is someone from the White Mountains will have a concern, someone from southern Arizona will have a concern, someone from the far east side of Arizona, and it's something that we in Metro Phoenix area may not encounter on a regular basis. So it's extremely interesting, and you get to learn a little bit about people and practices in other parts of the state. So I strongly encourage you to volunteer to be part of that process.
And you make contacts. So if you don't want to practice outside your expertise, send them off. You have a referral. So you get to meet extra people.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So I just want to let people who are in our remote areas know they can always send a message in on chat, or they can unmute and ask the question as well. And for those of you in the room, if you decide going forward you have a question for Nikki, just raise your hand. We have microphones so that people in the remote areas can hear your question, and then you can ask your question of Nikki with that microphone. So let's start out by identifying the elements of an enforceable contract. What is it we should be looking for?
Right, so we know that there's the basic elements to a contract, right? Offer, acceptance, consideration, and specificity. So you want to ensure first and foremost, that I'm assuming this is basic 101, right?
Let's just review it. Yeah, make
okay.
sure we all have all the components.
Okay. So you want to make sure that first and foremost there's an offer, there's consideration, which consideration can be a promise to a promise. You don't have to. We know that earnest money isn't necessarily the consideration, it's the property. The promise is to buy it, the promise is to sell it. And so that is plenty for a real estate purchase contract. That is just the offer. The consideration is that I'm going to promise to sell you and I'm going to promise to buy the property. So you need to have specificity in the contract, though. Real estate contracts, of course, they always have to be in writing. That is legally required. The statute of frauds, I'm sure we've all heard of the statute of frauds. Make sure that you are specific with where the property is located, what you're selling, any contingencies, all of those things, and that you want to make sure are written down. So you need to know the name of the parties, who's going to sell, who's going to buy, what the property is, the description of the property, the time frame for when the property is going to sell. Which, if you're using the standard contract, that's all located in the standard contract for you.
Okay. So now let's talk about items that might render a contract unenforceable or voidable, starting with the capacity of a person to contract. Tell us the elements of that. How do we know what that is?
So first and foremost, to be able to enter into a contract, you have to be of legal age, right? So you have to be 18 or older to enter into a contract. Otherwise, there isn't any type of capacity. You have to have your mental capabilities to be able to enter into a contract. Now, there's a question, especially with the elder population, on whether or not it would be enforceable. So if they're lucid at the point in time when they're contracting, that doesn't negate the fact that they entered into a contract to begin with. If they're not lucid, of course, that's going to be a defense. They're going to say, or whoever their representative is going to say they were not lucid at that point in time. They didn't have their mental faculties to be able to enter into any type of contract. We have a question, I think?
Oh, unmute and ask your question. Do you know which office it is? Mary Beth, unmute and ask your question.
Go ahead.
Yes, I have a question on the earnest deposit. Okay, I just had a contract and I wrote it up and I put 2,000 earnest deposit. And it's for new construction. They came back and they wanted 5,000 earnest deposit, non-refundable. And it asked everything the inspections had to do within the inspection fee. And that was fine. But I asked them, what would happen, with the interest rates going up, what would happen if the people at the end, for X reason, didn't qualify because of the interest rate? They said they would lose their money.
All right, hang on a second.
So
Mary Beth, can you bring the microphone closer or bring her closer to the microphone?
Yeah, we'll bring her closer.
Oh, that's so much better.
Okay, I have a question. I have an offer, I wrote up an offer, and it's on a new construction. I put $2,000 earnest deposit. They countered back with 5,000 non-refundable. And they had to do their inspection period was 12 days. And after the 12 days, if everything was fine, we go on. But I asked them, what would happen, because the way the market is right now with the interest, what would happen if my client, for X reason, did not, the interest went higher, she didn't qualify for that property? Would she get her $5,000 back? And they said no.
I would agree with that unless you made that earnest money deposit contingent upon whether or not they qualified for a loan. So if you just say that they want a non-refundable earnest deposit, it would have to be very specific in saying non-refundable contingent upon loan, financing, obtaining financing. Otherwise, just a blanket statement saying that it's non-refundable, you haven't. There isn't a trigger to say when it isn't. It's non-refundable at this point in time.
So even though, doesn't it protect it on the contract on the fact that, it doesn't state someplace that if you don't qualify, then you get your money back? I mean, it's the contract doesn't involve financing.
Yeah, I think just that you're saying that it's non-refundable, period.
That's what they're saying. I can hear them in the background.
So here's the thing. Most new build have their own contract. That can be substantially different or similar to what you see as an Arizona Association of REALTORS contract. But you have the ability to negotiate with that new home builder. I certainly have done that. I've literally taken out a yellow pad and paper with my client there, and we've written down the things we needed to see changed. And in one case, the new home builder, it was the first subdivision they'd done here in Arizona. It was a Georgia home builder. There was a whole bunch of things in that contract that are just flat wrong here in Arizona. It just goes against Arizona revised statutes. So I'm like, nope, we're going to change that. We're going to change that. We're going to change that. So you have the ability to negotiate in those terms. If you get in that situation, the type of not just earnest money, but some other things might be things that you want to think about.
Right. Well, and even if, let's say, even if it were the AAR contract, and not, contracts aside, you said that they countered for that amount. So that's going to negate any of the boilerplate language anyways. So anytime you have a contract and you have specific terms that are written in, they're going to always override whatever the boilerplate verbiage is. So there isn't ambiguity in the contract when the parties have clearly defined that they are going to agree to a new term that was written in.
Okay?
Does that help?
Yep. So then we have to, in other words, we just have to say only contingent upon them not qualifying, regardless of the 12 days inspection period, right? Right. Yes, they're gonna have to.
I think they're talking about trying to put in
Okay.
Yeah.
the
What
contingency.
they should rate.
So if you are going to be negotiating a contract with a builder on specific terms, whether it's finance terms or others, you really need at some point to go to your broker and get them to help you with this. They will have language that they want you to use. They will have considerations they want you to be talking to the builder about. And that's really where you're going to get your most important information is through your broker and their ability to help you.
Yeah, first and foremost, always go to your broker, right? Your broker they're your broker for a reason. They have been through it. They have agents underneath them. They've probably already seen this exact scenario or something similar that you're going through, and they can help you work through it faster and easier and provide what it is that you need without having to be reactive as opposed to proactive.
So let me circle back to the capacity of a person to contract. You had talked about age, mental ability. How about undue influence?
Yeah, so if somebody is fraudulently induced to enter into a contract, whether it be coercion or or undue influence,
Right.
then that's going to be your defense to a contract. So what is coercion? Coercion is when somebody has physically, and I'm going to do a fine line of distinguishing because they're so closely related, yes. Right? So coercion is, it's like a physical threat. So you sign this and you enter into this contract to sell your property, or I'm going to harm someone you love, right? Or I'm going to create something that's going to harm you. Undue influence is more, and you're going to see it more so in relationships. Liz and I were talking yesterday, and she said usually the standard that you learn in real estate classes are the husband standing over the wife. But it doesn't have to be that. Again, I always tend to fall back on elder abuse, right? Because it's going to be the person saying, well, they're going to emotionally abuse them or make them feel guilty or something along those lines that causes them to think that, or persuade them to think that this is the best avenue for them, even though they didn't want to do it on their own free will.
And you have to be sort of aware of that. When it comes to mental ability, we tend to think of some type of mental illness or incapacity for other reasons. I will just say you have to be very careful sometimes in your situations and sort of get a read of this person. I had an incident one time where I was in the home, an elderly gentleman who had just gotten back from a major surgery. We talked about everything under the sun. Everything was good and golden, and at some point, though, he made a statement that just didn't quite track. It's sort of like he lost his, and that was fine because we all do that. But then I noticed his eyes were starting to get a little glazy, And at one point, I just said, so how are you doing? Tell me what, now that you're home from the hospital, what's going on? And he held up a bag that was, I swear to you, a 1-gallon Ziploc bag of medications. And I looked at that and I went, so are you on all those? He went, yep. I said, you know what? I think we need to stop. Don't worry about this right now. We'll put this on pause. I think you need to get better. And he may have just been super overtired. But anyone who's on a 1-gallon bag of Ziploc bag of medications, a lot of which are pain medications and other types of medications that can short circuit you. You just don't want them signing something that's super important, like a real estate transaction deal. And so I paused it. In that particular situation, there was a lot of other ancillary angst that went along. It didn't matter. I'm not going to allow this gentleman to sign a contract or addendum to a contract until I feel he's okay to do that. That means I have to see certain things change and be okay. Yes, I did get flack. And it was and I was doing bank owned at the time. So yeah, I got the federal government type of bank. I don't care. That's my job, is to make sure whatever happens at that kitchen table is what should happen. So just be aware. Sometimes you have to be a little more nuanced in what's going on when people start talking about some of the things that are happening in their lives. They may be on medications that you don't even know about, but they can start to exhibit some traits, and then they may give you a really good answer like, yeah, all this I'm on.
Yeah, I mean, we're not the experts in health, right?
Right.
But you should be cautious. And if you know something, I mean, because when you have a client, you guys basically become, you're interacting with each other. You're best friends by the end of the transaction, hopefully, unless there was some sort of turmoil. But you might be able to identify something, and you just want to be cautious of those things, especially when dealing with people that could be on medication or elderly or whatever the case is. We have a question right here.
So I practice mainly commercial real estate, and we always have a lawyer involved with this type of, and the one time I had an opportunity to do this with someone who was questionably mentally able, that lawyer insisted on meeting with them 3 times in 3 separate occasions to ensure that they have mental capacity. Is that not the case with real estate, residential transactions, the best practices?
That's a really good practice, but I don't practice real estate, so I'll let Liz answer
Well,
that.
in real estate, and generally speaking, in residential transactions, we don't have lawyers involved.
Right.
It's the buyer and the seller, and we are facilitating that transaction. And that's why it becomes important for us to be aware at different points. Is there anything in here that might prevent the person I'm talking to from actually being able to contract? And that's why the agents have to be super aware. We don't have attorneys on the residential side. We are not an attorney state, so we are not required to have attorneys. If you went back east, there'd be attorneys involved on every transaction all the time. But we're not an attorney state.
Yeah, so they amended the Constitution, Article 26, I believe,
26, yeah.
To allow for real estate agents to write in contracts.
So one other thing I wanted to bring up, as far as one of the things that we need to look for or be cognizant of for unenforceability or potentially avoidable, if someone's in bankruptcy. So talk about what that could mean.
So bankruptcy, if you've never dealt with a bankruptcy before, generally speaking, we all know what bankruptcy is, right? Where somebody's claimed that they can no longer pay their bills, so now they're waiting for a court to decide whether or not to, depending on what type of bankruptcy they've filed, to reorganize their debts or to allow for their debts to for them to not have to pay back some of their debts. So in the event that there is a bankruptcy, you need to know as a practitioner that you have to get approval from the court to be able to sell the home, and for their listing agreement for you to be paid, because the court when a person is in bankruptcy, the court is deciding who gets paid, how they get paid, how much they're going to get paid in the process. That's all part and parcel of the process. I'm not a bankruptcy attorney, so I can't really give any more than a very big broad overview of it. But what you need to know as a practitioner is that you have to have approval by the court.
So make sure if you have someone who's distressed that you know if they filed bankruptcy, and then that you're getting the instructions from the bankruptcy court.
Right.
So as we go through, let's talk about, this is one of those topics that we very seldom in residential have to deal with, although increasingly we are. In commercial, they deal with it all the time, and it's the UCC. So when we are talking about a property that has personal property and it's attached, we have traditionally thought of that, okay, now it's part of the real property. But now we're talking about things like the leased solar panels. Those are going to have a UCC. They are personal property, but they're attached, but they're not yours to keep.
Right.
That type of thing. In a restaurant or something like that, it may be a stove or overhood.
Right, the
hood,
equipment.
Right, the equipment itself. So talk to us a little bit about what a UCC is and the contract considerations that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, so whenever, excuse me, whenever the UCC is involved, so the UCC stands for the Uniform Commercial Code. And there are laws that surround what is going to happen when a consumer enters into an agreement with somebody that is selling them commercial goods amongst other items. And so part of those goods, as Liz said, is going to be solar. That's what we're going to be most familiar with. And in the event that, so what that essentially means is I didn't pay as the owner, I didn't pay for all of those products up front. Instead, I have a lease or I'm making payments. It's financed through the company that I'm purchasing these items through. And so they file a UCC. One, usually it's a financing statement that lets everybody know and puts them on notice, hey, I have priority here because this person, this consumer owes me money for the product that we have entered into agreement for them to repay me the funds. So in the context of residential real estate, we know generally speaking, we're going to see that as solar panels. And it's funny because last night as we were talking, I went on, and if you go on, so let's say you have a listing agreement or with your client, commercial, regardless, let's say they don't know, whether it's commercial, residential, you can go on the Secretary of State and look up UCC liens. So last night I was on the Secretary of State and I put in Smith because I'm like, I don't know anybody that has solar, but I'm just gonna put in Smith, and of course, I don't even know how many names came up. So I just started clicking on names just to see and pulling up documents just to take a look and see what does this document say, and it tells you, if it's it could be tax related or it could be a filing for a good. And it'll tell you if it's been released and everything's been taken care of, or if there is a lien that exists. And so if your homeowner says, I don't know, it was so long ago that I entered into this, I thought I bought them. I haven't made a payment. I'm not sure. Or my husband made the payment and he's no longer alive. I don't know. I honestly have no clue. That's a resource to go to send them to look it up if you need to find out information.
So now, when we're talking about something, and I don't know if you want to if we can switch to the commercial side or not, but when we're talking about equipment on the commercial side of the fence, I may be leasing my space, but then I have, in the case of a restaurant, a stove, a hood, or something like that, and that has the UCC. Are there considerations within the lease that we as practitioners should be aware of to make sure that at the end of that lease, our tenant still has the ability to take that equipment with them? Obviously, they still owe the money, but to make that transfer so that it's obvious to the landlord as well, that stove's not staying there.
Right, I think, so generally speaking, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not as familiar with commercial as I am residential, but we do have a commercial contract and some commercial forms. For the most part, we have negotiated with AIR for commercial folks to use their forms, and I know they recently just revised all their forms, so that's fantastic. But generally speaking, those are items that you're going to negotiate in the commercial contract itself and determine what exists, what do you have a lien on, are you taking that, are you leaving that, how does that operate? So that's just part and parcel of the negotiations for commercial properties. Yeah.
Okay, for those of you in the remote, our commercial agent said you make an amendment and then you list those items out. Thank you. All right, so let's take a look at some of the current government policy, legislation, or regulatory issues that may impact our contract writing. First of all, let's start with the parties to the contract. One element of the contract is to declare who the buyer is and who the seller is. If someone is acting on behalf of one of those parties, who that person is and what powers they have. Is it a power of attorney? which, by the way, if you have someone give you a power of attorney, for heaven's sakes, read that thing. I had someone give me a power of attorney for a real estate transaction. It was a medical power of attorney.
Right,
Not
right.
helpful.
That's right. You don't get to sign the contract on their behalf.
No. Corporations, individuals, LLCs, trustees, executors. There's so many different types of people
Right.
that can be the person that is able to actually contract. So help us understand where we discover, how we go about discovering who the actual person is who can sign that contract, and in the commercial world particularly, but sometimes in probate or other circumstances, it may be one person or even corporations, LLCs. One person has the right to negotiate, one
Right.
person has the right to sign. How do we determine those things?
Right. So you have to be proactive to ensure that you know that the person that's signing the contract, that they have the ability to either sell the property or to purchase the property. Now, a corporation, you can look up on the Arizona Corporation Commission if there's a name that they've just listed the name of the corporation. If you go to Arizona Corporation Commission, so I can't tell you if it's acc.gov. I just have it saved as a favorite at the top of my computer. But anyways, you would go there and you can look up and it'll tell you the members or whoever it is part of that corporation. And so you want to ensure first and foremost that they always provide you the documentation. Give proof, right? And do you have the authorization to sign on that person's behalf? Are you the executor of the estate? Can you sign the documents on their behalf? Are you somebody that is in good standing with the corporation and that you can also sign the documents? Always ask for proof. There are so many times I can tell you that even with complaints that we've received, at the association, they said, we were laughing one day. What did they call them? They said, it was a self-appointed power of attorney. And we were like, for lack of a better term, she had some term for it. And all of us, we were like, well, what is that? We've never even heard of something. I mean, it's self-appointed is what it is. There's not an actual document. I decided that I'm going to be in charge of my folks' estate because I don't think that they have their wherewithal. And so I decided that I'm going to intervene in this transaction. And now I'm going to take control. And you have to tell me, agent, everything that's going on. But do they really have the rights? No. I mean, but part of that is the conversation too. I think part of that is the conversation is, okay, prove to me that you have a power of attorney. I can't give you any information because I have a duty to my client, right? I have agency law that tells the things that I can share with other folks. And if you don't have that ability, I can't share that information with you. So make sure that you get the documentation from those folks. If they're claiming that they have the right to be able to know about the transaction, to be able to sign the documents, make them prove it to you. And it doesn't have to be rude, it can just be simply saying, look, here's the reasons why I need you to give me this information. I have these duties, and you're telling me that you're trying to go over the boundaries of what I'm allowed to do as a practitioner, and that's not okay. I'm not going to put my license on the line for that. Yes.
Oh, we need a microphone.
It's better to do it upfront rather than get to the closing.
Sure.
Hang on a second. We're going to have you ask that question over the microphone. Just a moment. You're okay.
I just said that title's gonna ask for that anyways, even if it's an LLC or whatever. So do it up front, because if not, you're gonna get to the closing. Oh, sorry, you're not authorized to sign, and then everything falls apart.
But that's part of the conversation, right? And I think that that's where we fall down a lot, is we forget to have that conversation and explain. Because, I mean, how many of us were raised with, because I told you so? I was, I wasn't told, here's the reasons why. This is why we were doing what we're doing. Because I think most people tend to be fairly reasonable. And if you give them the explanation and the reason behind why you were asking or doing what you were doing, it's going to make sense. And they're going to say, oh, I didn't know that. Makes sense to me. Let me help you out.
So in being proactive, several times in this recent 6 to 8 months, I've had people contact me to sell houses, and I took the initiative to look it up, and they had quitclaimed their portion of the house, whether it be divorce or maybe family member, whatever. So I think it's our responsibility to take a minute and look up the tax records. And on those tax records, look at recorded documents to see, do they have the right to actually enter into a
Absolutely.
contract
Be
on that?
proactive. Always be proactive.
Yeah, does it you no good to get to the listing table and have someone sign a listing agreement and they don't actually have rights to the property? And we had that 10 years ago. We had that all the time. One spouse would be on title, and the other spouse would be on the loan. And the spouse in the loan inevitably thought that they are also on. You're not on title. I have to have someone who has that. If you remember back, the escrow we used to come back through, and they probably still do today. If one spouse didn't have the credit rating that allowed them to get the loan they wanted, they would ask them to waive that, and people would just unilaterally waive that, not realizing what they had just waived. So we have to be really careful because people just don't realize those things. But we need to make sure that we're having the proper contract signed and negotiated by the proper person, whether it's an individual or it's an entity. That becomes, and keep in mind, people buy and sell property through all sorts of different entities. If you're helping someone buy and sell property through an IRA, there's a certain way things have to be in order for it to actually qualify for that IRA investment. So it's LLCs, it's corporations, it's your investment vehicles. There's a lot of things that
Right.
require you to know exactly what's going on. And how those contracts should read and how they should be signed and by whom.
Yeah, and which is, thank you for bringing up the tax records, because of course that's, I think, where most people go 1st, right?
So now next out of that, we've decided we need to know who it is we're dealing with and what rights they have to either contract or negotiate or both. But one of the things that we are now hearing, particularly on the fair housing side of the discussion, is people saying, well, I don't want to identify my buyer in the purchase agreement. I will tell you after you have accepted this agreement and we're going to escrow, then I'll tell you who my buyer is. Now, from my side of the fence, I'm looking at it going, I don't know who this person is. I don't know if they have the wherewithal. I don't know if they have the rights. I don't know anything about this. How am I supposed to encourage my seller to enter into a contract when I don't even know who that person is? And for me, my question is that really make for a legitimate contract negotiation?
And so I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, when the contract is signed, you want to ensure that the parties are both there, right? They're identified. They're clearly identified. I think in this crazy market that we've had for the last couple of years, now in that market, especially because everybody came out with stay away from love letters, be aware of fair housing, and I think that that's what we're talking about here and the best approach, in my opinion, to something like that is create an Excel spreadsheet. Put the major terms on that Excel spreadsheet. So it'd be offer one. You don't have to put the name, and I think that that's where that's coming from. Where it really is, because somebody could look at someone's name and say, "I'm not selling to what looks to be this type of name," right? And that's kind of where they say err on the safe side, but with all of the offers, I think as long as you were just presenting the major terms and saying, here are the terms. Now, when it comes time to actually sign the contract, of course you're going to have the name, and and the party is going to know, the selling party is going to know who the name is, and you can, especially if you're the practitioner and you need to make sure that they have the ability to either purchase or sell, you're going to have that proof upon signing of the contract. And that's the important part, is to make sure you have that information once it comes time for the parties to sign. Now, I think that that's the way you work yourself around fair housing and not have to worry so much about a violation. Alternatively, if you're submitting the document, most people, I shouldn't say most people because I don't know, I don't practice, but if they are to make a comment about somebody's name, that's your red flag, right? That's your red flag to say, whoa, now we cannot violate fair housing. And here's what happens in the event, when you're making comments like that, you can fire your client. You can always fire your client, but you want to be weary about things like that, because it doesn't necessarily mean just because they have the name that it's going to be a fair housing violation. It's just if you were to they were to make some sort of comment about it thereafter, then you have the potential of violating fair housing.
So go ahead. We need a microphone. Where's the microphone at?
It's a short question, if you can just repeat it, Liz.
Oh,
Sure.
okay. Go ahead.
Prequel, you need proof of funds.
Pre-qual proof of funds for our remotes. So how are we supposed to do that without a name?
Yeah, I don't, so again, if you're just submitting an Excel spreadsheet that just says here, and we know we have these items, I mean, your email could very well say, here are the offers, I've received all the information I need in advance, or even said, the pre-qual says that they are qualified for this. Again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't provide a name. You would have to be wary in the event that you heard a comment.
So, and so this brings us to, and this is where the negotiation part of the transaction concerns me with that, the ABC, is we're just putting out, here's the terms. But in real estate, we'll have our client says, I just do not want to sell to a corporation. I don't want to sell to BlackRock, right? So I don't want to sell to a corporation. I want to sell to a person. And yet, how am I supposed to convey that information if I can't say this came from ABC Corporation as opposed to Joe and Susie? And I've had clients who have taken less money to sell to Joe and Susie.
Sure.
Because that was important.
I mean,
to
a
them.
corporation isn't a protected class either. So
Right, but if I have to do all of them as A, B, C, D, E,
right,
this
you
is
don't
where the
have
confusion
to.
is, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, and
Yeah,
you
this is the
absolutely
confusion
don't
gets
have
into.
to.
Okay.
It just was a suggestion.
Okay.
That when you have all these, especially to maintain and to be able to organize, right? Because
Right.
you had, your property would go on the market and all of a sudden you would have 50 offers, 30 offers, right? I'm talking about crazy times when the best way to organize your information would be in such a manner like
Right.
that. If you're concerned, you don't have to take those extra steps because we all know that the ADRE requires that you submit the offer to your client, right?
Right.
The code of ethics,
Right.
you have to do it immediately. So you have those things on top of it that you have to ensure that your client is receiving the offers. It was just a suggestion for the times of
Okay.
when I think the best way to organize all of the offers.
Okay, so the tip here is, once again, guess who you get to talk to? Your broker. If you get concerned about whether you should do something or not in a particular way,
Right.
you go back to your broker and have them instruct you on what they think is the best way to do it.
Right, they might have created something that they have in their brokerage.
Right, and they might have parameters or something like that, so make sure you're doing that. So I want to talk about this new real estate contract assignment law that came into existence. For me, I will just be straight up. I think it confuses some terminologies. So that's sort of where I came from. If you have never done an as or assigns transaction, and that's what we're talking about, someone will put their name on a purchase contract. Joe Smith and or assigns. What that tells the seller is this buyer, either that person, the buyer, the name, will buy this property under the contract terms, or they may end up assigning that contract to someone else who will finally be the final buyer. That's what and or assigns is. So apparently in the marketplace, we had some people who were concerned about those types of transactions, and it went through and it was signed by Governor Ducey, so 90 days after signing die, it will become law.
Right.
So as I was reading through it, my first concern was I'll be honest with you, I didn't see a reason for it, but my concerns really came about now for me, we don't have clarity. Prior, we had and or assigns, which meant that I had three parties to this transaction if the contract got assigned. I had the seller, the owner of the property, I had the assignor and the assignee, and I knew who each of those people were. But we have new terminology, which is wholesale buyer and wholesale seller. And I will just tell you, I mean, I really don't get the wholesale seller part of it because this person's not a seller.
Right.
So
Which is the
why are we
point.
calling them a seller? They're not.
Right. So first and foremost, if you don't, the legislative session is still in currently. So sine die means 90 days once the legislative session ends. And so it's late June. They thought it was going to be over with mid-June, and that was going to be late, but it still isn't over. So we don't anticipate this law. It won't be effective, for quite some time, for at least 3 months once legislative session ends. But first and foremost, so contracts are always assignable. There's not a law that says you can't assign a contract. So generally speaking, when you draft a contract, if it doesn't even have to say and or assigns because it's already assignable, unless of course the contract specifically states it is not assignable. then it isn't assignable, right? So you don't have to worry about that portion. You don't have to add the extra verbiage. It's really unnecessary, because in the state of Arizona, we allow for that. Now, the reason for the wholesale legislation, I shouldn't say the reason for, because we weren't part of that. It was introduced by some other entities, and mostly because we know with this crazy market, what people were coming in just to be able to sign their rights to another party to wholesale it, right? They're wholesalers. They're not regulated by the Department of Real Estate because they don't hold, they don't hold a license. People can't tell them what to do. And what the seller was getting upset because they were finding out that I just entered into a contract with A, and now A is selling their rights to that contract to B, and they just made X amount of dollars. And it was literally like hours later or a day later or however long it could have been. And so, they were getting complaints. Everybody, the ADRE, us, of course, I'm sure you guys were receiving complaints about sellers really feeling like they were wronged, that it's unfair. Where's the fairness in this? And that it doesn't feel right, especially because the market, it could literally, we increased our prices so much, so quickly. And so whoever brought forth this legislation, they wanted the disclosure. They wanted those wholesalers to have skin in the game. They wanted those wholesalers to say, hey, you need to disclose upfront to the seller that it doesn't say intent, but my intent when I'm entering into this contract with you is to earn financial gain off of this. So what I'm planning to do is I'm a wholesaler, and I'm going to go ahead and sell this, my interest now, because I'm under contract with you, so I only have an interest in the property. I don't own the property. My equitable interest consists of now I'm going to be able to purchase this property. I'm going to go ahead and sell that equitable interest to somebody else for a profit. Now, the law doesn't say for a profit, the new statute doesn't, but that was really the intent, what we
Well,
were
traditionally, you
hoping.
get a fee, right? If I'm flipping that contract,
Right.
then I go under contract and I say, oh, Susie, over here, would you like to execute on this contract and end up being the buyer? That'll cost you $5,000, $10,000, because I
Right.
did all the work to find it. I negotiated it.
Right.
It's not like I didn't do anything. So that's where they were coming in. It was like, yeah, I put the deal together, basically, right?
Right.
So that was always true. Now, here's my question. As it was pre this law, if I went under contract to purchase a property and then I ended up deciding I needed to flip that contract for whatever reason to someone else, didn't I have to come back to the seller and say, oh, buyer's not me anymore, buyer's this person over here? And did the seller have a right to say, I don't accept that?
No.
Okay, so they had to accept whoever I sent the contract to.
Right. So if I assign a contract, it doesn't matter if the person that I'm assigning the contract to fulfills their obligations, because me, as the original person that contracted with the seller, I'm always on the hook to
Right.
complete that purchase. So if I assign it and then the person that I assign those rights to failed to be able to come up with the funds or to be able to close escrow, then ultimately it still falls back on me because I'm the original person that entered into that contract.
Right, you were obligated to make that contract happen on those terms.
Yeah,
Yes.
but what the law says now, if you're a wholesaler, is that you have to disclose that, right?
Upfront, yes.
Right, to disclose, because they were making more than 5,000, right?
Depending on the
times,
contract, right?
They were making, excessive amounts of money, and I think that was where the bad feeling came from the sellers. Again, I don't know who
Right.
prompted the start of the legislation, the statute, but the reason that they have, so the skin in the game that they have is if you don't disclose this up front and then we thereafter find out that you assigned that contract to somebody else, I, as the seller, I can cancel this contract and now I get to keep your earnest money. And so that is really the importance behind that legislation, is they wanted to make sure that there was full disclosure so that the seller was aware of all things encompassing that contract.
Go ahead.
So if you're under contract and you have a buyer that 5 days before your closing says, oh, my investment group has decided they don't want to move forward on any properties that are built prior to 1990. And you're 5 days away from closing and you don't know if you're going to close. If that buyer does not perform, does the seller only get their earnest money back, or can they go after that buyer for non-performance?
So the contract, if you're using the AAR contract, right, it says in the contract that you can, if you can't figure out what the damages would be, you could accept the earnest money, and that could be your damages. Alternatively, you could decline to accept the earnest money and you can pursue them with other remedies. There's other remedies that exist in law that say you can pursue them for specific performance, you could pursue them for other types of damages. So it doesn't always mean that you have to accept the earnest money. Now, there are instances that are written directly into the contract. So in the event that your loan contingency fail, it says specific, I'd have to pull the contract, but it says specifically, then the earnest money deposit is your only remedy. But unless it happens to be that one specific instance, you have other remedies in law that you can pursue besides just accepting the earnest money deposit.
So I'm just going to put this out there for you to be aware. Wholesaler within this law is now wholesale buyer, wholesale seller, assign or assignee. But if you're out in the marketplace, a wholesaler is someone who bird dogs, basically, right? And they may own the properties. They may just go find the properties and you pay them a fee to find the properties you want. They may go bid for you down at the courthouse steps. There's a lot of things that a wholesaler does. So one of my big concerns with this is that we start getting terminology confused and calling somebody a wholesaler, and then they are assumed to only do as or assignee deals. And that's just not true. In the marketplace, wholesalers do a variety of things, and so that's where the terminology problems for me come in. And it clouds the assignor, assignee titles that we know legally are what we're talking about.
Yeah. So I think where people are going to try and twist the transaction a little bit is, let's say I'm under contract for a property, and then all of a sudden, guess what? I just took a job and it's not in the state anymore, and the market's been crazy, and so shoot, I can probably sell this property by assigning it to somebody. My intent when I went in to purchase this property wasn't to wholesale it. My intent was to purchase the property. But now that I've found out, hey, I might be able to make a couple bucks on this and be able to
Right.
still sell the home because I can no longer purchase it. Maybe now I'm just going to assign it to somebody. And that's not the intent of the statute. The statute really is for those people that purposely were trying to make money off of it.
So I can still use this tool if my initial intention was to purchase and something happens, because that does happen where people need to flip the contract because something happened in their life.
Right.
Or
A
in
life
some
event.
cases, the buyer passes away and the
Right.
estate doesn't want to buy the house, but, right, and we're trying to not harm the seller, so we're going to use as or assignees, go find somebody, take the contract and execute on it. We can still use this tool then and not have to worry about this law coming in and saying, no, you got to kill the whole thing and start over again.
The law hasn't taken effect, so I can't
Right.
make any promises on that because it's not specific enough to say intent.
Thank you.
So I think that if we start, as practitioners, start seeing a problem with this law, then we need to take it to caucus and we need to say to Matt Connorelli, hey, we have these outliers that's happening, these unintended consequences, and so we need to tighten this up. So what are we going to do? So you need to you would give the association direction to next year or whenever it is that we start seeing, if we start seeing problems, say, let's go and let's revise this statute so we can tighten it up for us.
Right, that's going to be really important to keep awareness of. I just see that this one being one of those that has to be tweaked a couple times because real life is not going to comport with what the paper says. Yes.
You can repeat it, but use the mic.
Yeah, Max over there. Great.
In Scott's drawer, there's a copy of the Florida contract. The Florida contract that they use requires the seller's approval to assign. So I would strongly urge, in order to clean this up, maybe taking a look at that language, because it's pretty clear and maybe would solve some of these problems. The other way, as you said earlier, if you are representing a seller that maybe knows it's going to attract that fix or flip, you can put a clause in there to not make it assignable, or only
Absolutely.
assignable with client's permission, seller's
Yep.
permission.
Absolutely.
All right, so that goes down to things that within the contract contemporarily you can do,
Right.
right? If you're concerned about those issues or your seller is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Thank you, Dwayne.
we have a couple of, about 15, 20 minutes. And I wanted to get to a couple things. First of all, I know that, I think you all have a copy of the Benzer. I think we got you copies of the Benzer. That was just revised, and so I wanted to give Nikki a moment to be able to talk about what you're looking at on the revised Benzer.
Okay, so when we say it's just revised, you may or may not remember a year ago or so, we were working on a revised Binzer and we sent it out to the loop, and we ended up, we were stuck. So it's a complicated form, believe it or not, to revise. So technically it hasn't been revised yet. We just had a work group again. It had been almost a year. And so we decided, we opened it back up because we needed the purchase contract to be opened up so that we could effectuate changes to the Binzer. Now, we don't know if this is going to pass, but you guys would be the first and foremost, because the work group was just a couple days ago, to know kind of where it's headed. And the loop from a year ago, it was headed in the same direction. But this is, I like this direction that we're heading in now. The work group opted to loosen up the verbiage in the purchase contract, because we know what's happening in practice. People are writing on the Binzer, they're not writing on an addendum, they're renegotiating. They don't necessarily want repairs, but you have to list any of those items that you disapprove of, because that's what the contract requires. The contract requires that if you don't, if you disapprove during your inspection period of any items, list them on the Binzer, because the Binzer is the form that you have to say, I don't approve of these items. And then at that point in time, you can decide, buyer, what you want to do. Do you want to cancel at that point in time? Do you want to try to ask the seller to repair any of those items? Seller, do you want to correct any of those items? So the contract, or the verbiage in the contract, has kind of, we're trying to broaden it to say, to fit what the current, what is currently happening in the industry right now. So in other words, we know you're negotiating. Everybody is negotiating. It's kind of reopened up for negotiations. We don't like to say that up front and direct, because how bad does that feel for the seller? And doesn't it feel lopsided at that point in time? Because it does, but it happens, and it's bound to happen, and that's just part of reality. So the verbiage is being opened up to say something along the lines of not to negotiate, but do you approve? You can take a look at the items, and if you disapprove of the items, you can not. I can't think of the exact word, because I was literally just working on this yesterday. Michelle Lind and I were. That it basically allows for them to say, okay, we could potentially ask to negotiate the contract, but we're not putting it out there. So by just specifically saying it, we're going to allow the parties, though, if they so choose, to enter into what is already happening, to be able to negotiate those repairs instead of performing repairs, to be able to negotiate a credit or price reduction, whatever that case is. It would just make the verbiage broad enough to allow for that to occur.
Good.
Without getting into specifics, because we're not there yet.
And then you release an update to the solar addendum.
Right. So the solar addendum, you guys know that in February the solar addendum was revised. Previously, the solar addendum only addressed leased solar systems, but the folks out there, the practitioners, said, no, we need this information too for if solar is owned. Or maybe the solar isn't owned. There's other ways that maybe the seller doesn't, they have solar, they don't own it, the utility folks own it, and the utility folks are saying, hey, they're basically just renting space, your roof space, by having the solar on there, and they're going to offset it in your utility bill. But really, what they cared about too was, if you shut off your electricity, or if you don't tell, or if, let's say I scheduled my electricity to shut off on close of escrow or the day before close of escrow because inspections are all performed, now the new buyer might not necessarily have the same credits as what the seller previously had. So they really wanted the parties to be aware that those things exist, and you need to ensure that you are calling the utility folks and finding out what happens. Do we get to stay on the same program? If you own it, we want to ensure that we stay on the program. Is this a utility-owned solar system, and how does that operate for me? Because that could mean, a significant cost where maybe my buyer can no longer afford to have this property, right?
So it becomes really important if you have a utility-owned solar system, having had this in real life happen, government policy influences what those deals are. So when the government came out about 10 years ago and said, we have a goal for all of our utility companies to have X percentage of renewable energy by a certain date, which they have now redone, so that's out there again, then what the utilities did is they said, we're going to do a roof lease, and people will go for that. It'll offset significantly their utility bill. We're going to lease their roof for 20 years or whatever it is that they needed. It was a really great deal. I had one client. She basically was guaranteed she would never pay more than X amount. It was like $100 a month ever. The entire time that she lived in that house, forever and ever that she had those. It was a great deal. She went to go sell it though, and that deal was only specific to her. If that property transferred for any reason, she passed away and her heirs got it, she sold it. If she ever was not the person living in that house, that deal went away. And it was based on what the contemporary deal of the moment for that utility was, which I'm going to tell you right now, looked nothing like her deal. So it stopped us at the listing table saying, okay, what are we going to do to make this property now marketable? You have a killer deal, but that's not going to happen to the next person. In fact, the math on the next person is ugly. So what are we going to do to make this more marketable? It meant not listing it, waiting about 6 to 8 months for her to do a few things financially that would then make her property more marketable for the next person. That's coming back again. The government has put out criteria or quotas for the utility companies to have a certain amount of renewable energy, and they're already reintroducing these types of programs. So when you go in, make sure that you understand what that is, and more importantly, your seller does, because she didn't realize it until I sat there and said, we have to look at this for real. And then she realized, and she goes, well, I wouldn't buy this house with that criteria either. I went, okay, that's a problem.
Right.
So yes, all that's very important, and it goes to which contracts you enter into on what terms at what point.
Yeah, so they really do need to contact the solar folks, and but who anymore? Finding those contracts. We know most homeowners don't know where things are located.
But remember, we have the law from a few years ago. Gosh, it's probably about 5 years ago now, but I think about 5 or 6 years ago, that says that the seller is responsible to going to their provider and getting the most recent documents, and that provider by law must provide them the most recent documents.
Right.
So it's a process, right? Once again, you may not want to go active on the market until your seller has all that, so you can disclose it quickly.
Right.
So let's go to another form that I think is underused, potentially because people don't even realize it's there, and that's that additional clause addendum.
Yeah, how many of you guys use the additional clause addendum?
Good. Ooh, nice.
So we don't have to talk to this room. It was really, when I started at the association, it was a very highly underutilized form. And, we've done our best to really get it out there and to tout the use of this form and what benefits it has for practitioners, because we've created the clauses for you. The association has put a lot of the major clauses that you're going to see or need to use, and we've inserted them here for you to be able to just use this form and not recreate their wheel. Because what happens when we all start creatively writing our own clauses, right? I don't know how many of you have been sued. If you've been creatively writing your own clauses, don't recreate the wheel. Use what we have. It's vetted, right? It's vetted by the attorneys. It's vetted by a work group. So the practitioners are involved. And here's what really happens in the real world. You lawyers don't know because you just know the law, but you don't know how we practice it. And this is how practice and the law can collide together and to create clauses that will work for you as an industry. And I can tell you that, and I looked this morning actually to see how often this form has been revised, because it feels like we're revising it every time we turn around. Like this morning, earlier today, I said, I have 3 requests for the form, for this particular form, to have revisions. So the appraisal waiver, they want it just changed to appraisal waiver contingency, or appraisal contingency waiver. We have another one with the new teams legislation coming out to add in verbiage. Wait, is it no? It's the wholesaling. Sorry, with the new wholesaling legislation coming in, for them to be able to disclose up front in the additional clause addendum if they are a wholesaler, so that they could just check the box. So that's something that might be coming forward. We're going to propose it to the risk management company or committee. Sorry, and I think I have another suggestion. I have a few other suggestions for tightening up verbiage even within the additional clause addendum. And so, a lot of these things they're not in the purchase contract because they're not clauses that you're going to use every day. They're just clauses that kind of, sometimes it's just the way the market is at this point in time, which is why we created the appraisal waiver. That verbiage was added because look what kind of market we were in. We needed to find a way for a shortfall. If your property didn't appraise and there was a shortfall, how are we going to make up for that shortfall? How is that going to work in practice? And so that verbiage came out solely due to a market condition. And I know that a lot of brokers were very happy that it was created so that their agents would quit creating verbiage that says, okay, now what do we do? Do we have to decrease the price of the home based on this verbiage? Do they just get out of the contract? Are they going to make up the difference? How much difference are they going to make up? So you want to, if you haven't looked at it, you want to. And, and for also the folks, I know I've spoken about, so let's see, I'm going to go over some of the titles in here. We have the appraisal shortfall. I've talked about the all cash sale appraisal contingency, tax deferred, a 1031 exchange, water. We all know water is really important in Arizona. It always has been, but it seems to be out there in the forefront right now. And especially those folks that are in the water adjudication, to make sure that your rights are being transferred to the current, from one property owner to the next.
And then let's talk about, because they're coming back, short sales. You had a lot of experience in the private sector on short sales. So give us a couple of things that we need to remember about short sales.
Let's hope that short sales don't come back to the extent that they were. I don't think that they're going to, right? But because we had a lot of cash buyers that purchased homes too. But short sales, remember, how many of you folks practiced during the short sale era? So, it was emotionally draining, right? For those of you that have never practiced in the short sale era, you have to prepare your clients and let them know that if they can gather their documents, their financial documents, their bank statements, anything that they owe money on in advance, and have those prepared, because the bank, hopefully, the banks created their processes back in the short sale days, and they started to become a well, oiled machine with regard to their processes. In the beginning, it wasn't so much that way. So hopefully those processes would still be intact in the event that we end up in that type of situation again, in that type of market. But if the buyers or the sellers are at least prepared to know, I'm going to have to provide these documents, and they're going to have to be 30 days, very recent, in other words, so that the bank knows that I'm not joking around here. I need to short sell this home. They look at your financials. They look in depth, your hardship letter. Why are we going to allow for this sale to occur, and for somebody, buyer, to come in and purchase a home for less than what you owe on the property? Although again, I don't know how many short sales are currently going on right now, but in the event that we end up, prepare, communicate, ensure that they know that it's a longer process. It's not a quick process.
And for those of you who know that the half the programs were taken away at one point, the Biden administration just reinstated them about 6 to 8 months ago, exactly as we knew them. So for
Yay.
those of you, just like, open that drawer, you have all the documents. They're exact same documents that you're familiar with. And the Dodd-Frank documents have not changed either. So I just want to make sure.
That's good to know.
Yeah, I know. That was a drama fest there for a
Yeah.
while. It's like, yes, go ahead.
Are there any consideration of the anti-deficiency rules changing?
No, they're still the same.
Awesome.
Yeah. So generally speaking, right now as we're talking today, I just wanted to put that out there, make sure for those of you who might be putting your toe in that water. And then we have a couple minutes, and I just want to give you a chance to tell us one or two things that you think we need to be cognizant of, conscious of when it comes to writing contracts.
So first and foremost, and I just spoke about this, please do not use page 8 to creatively write your own clauses. Page 8, yes, it's beautiful, has all these lines, and it's tempting. It's very tempting, I'm sure, especially when your seller sees those lines or your buyer. Well, let's add these items in, right? But you want to, and we find that humorous, right? Because it is funny. It's not meant to be there. It's really for aesthetics because we needed to have the signatures on the same page, etc. But what we think, and there are times when I think that something I wrote makes perfect sense, right? That I thought, wow, there's that hole. I didn't realize that even me as a lawyer, wrote something that is still leaving you with questions. We don't know what's going to happen. If this, then what? Because you didn't write it well enough. So that's what the purpose of the additional clause addendum is. Check with your broker, have somebody else read it. Don't assume that anybody's going to understand what's in your brain and what happened to be put on paper. Because in our brains, we tend to write it and then still see what our brain is telling us, right? It takes either that or it takes a moment of stepping back and leaving it and coming back and reading that same document again, and you're like, well, that's not what that says. I thought that I said X, Y, Z, and it really only says X and Z. I'm missing the Y. And so that is super important. And I can tell you, Rick, when he talks at risk management committee meetings, that is one of the biggest calls and his biggest headaches, right? Hotline calls included. People saying that they've created verbiage. I know when I was a hotline attorney and I took calls, and I always give the same story. I had a broker call me and say, what does it mean when it says all personal property included? And I paused and I was like, what do you mean? What does it mean? So all personal property is included, of course. So whatever is in your home is included. And she was like, well, so here's the story. I found all these heirlooms in my attic, and I didn't know that they were there. I was like, well, that wasn't very specific then, was it? There wasn't an itemized list. Of course, we don't want to deal with personal property anyways. But that aside, it's just the point being is that what you think isn't always what happens. There could be an unintended consequence from it. So pass it through another person and see, if I gave this to you, what does this say? What do you think it means? And they could tell you if now don't think somebody that you're always talking to, because they might think along the same lines, but your broker, pass it through your broker.
Yes. That's terrific advice. Yeah, always end up at your broker's desk when you are uncertain, or even if you think you're pretty sure, because everyone's doing it. Always a bad phrase. A broker's nightmare. Everybody's doing it. Oh, excellent. So,
Right.
So go by their guidance. I want to thank you all for being here for this long period of time. We're going to take a 20-minute break because 10 minutes together. 20-minute break.
Ooh.
We're going to say thank you to Nikki for spending this time with us, and we'll see you back in 20 minutes.
Thank you.